Good evening, everybody. If you're just logging in, if you're just joining us, we'll give everybody 2 or 3 seconds to click in. I'm watching the numbers come up as people are entering, and we're really looking forward to hosting this webinar tonight. We can't wait to share some really great information with everybody, and wetlands are one of my favorite topics, so I'm really excited too. All right, counting upwards. All right, well, when we get to the magic number of 50, now I'll just go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for joining us. We are so thrilled that you're going to spend a little bit of time with us on a Tuesday night, and we've got some great speakers for you, and we're going to cover a lot of information, so we want to get going. So just wanted to say thank you to our speakers. We really appreciate that you're going to spend this time educating CBF members and the rest of the public about wetlands. We are recording this, and it generally takes our web team a couple days to put it up on the website, but everybody who registered will get a link to the recording, so be on the lookout for that. And as far as Q&A is concerned, we're going to ask that you pretty please put your questions in the Q&A section as opposed to raising your hand. It's just a whole lot easier for us to track. You can type your questions in there. If they get really, really long and convoluted, then you know, we can unmute you and you can ask the speakers that way. But for right now, I'm going to turn it over to Jay Ford. He's our policy and outreach advisor, and Jay is going to introduce our first speaker.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for giving us a little bit of your evening to talk about one of our favorite things, which is wetlands. They've been a hot topic of late this year, but for us in Bay worlds, it's hard to think of an ecosystem that plays a more vital role to water quality, really critical habitat, helping us with climate adaptation and resilience, because all that water has to go somewhere, recharging our groundwater. The list really is exhaustive about the many benefits of wetlands, and from our speakers tonight, you're going to hear a lot more about that. I am really excited about both of our speakers tonight. Our first, Pam Mason, she is a senior research scientist at the Center for Coastal Resource Management at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science at William and Mary. She has a BA in biology from the University of Delaware and an MS in marine science from William and Mary VIMS. She has been working on coastal resource issues for several decades with a focus on integrated management of shorelines, wetlands, and coastal community resilience. Her current research interest is multiple benefits of natural and nature-based features, including living shorelines, tidal and non-tidal wetlands, environmental policy, and coastal management. She has collaborated on environmental program guidance development with the Marine Resource Commission, the Department of Environmental Quality, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, the Virginia Secretary of Natural Resources, the EPA Region 3, and the Army Corps of Engineers. There's a special badge for having worked with all of those entities, and Pam has certainly earned it. She is an elected director of the Colonial Soil and Water Conservation Board representing York County, and she currently serves as the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Program Wetlands Work Group, and is on the Virginia Coastal Policy Team and the Virginia Soil and Water Conservation Board. If this exhaustive list is not enough to convince you, Pam is also one of our favorite partners in CBF land because she is exceedingly competent in all areas and really puts the Commonwealth's resources first in all of her work. So I always like to imagine in these things that you're all applauding in your house. So please give a very quiet round of applause to Pam, and I'll pass it over to you.
Wow, I should be gushing or blushing or all those things, but instead I laughed. Thank you, Jay. So I'm going to go ahead and get my talk going. So the first step then is obviously to share my screen. And I want to echo the thanks that Jay and Ann had offered to everyone who has joined tonight to learn a little bit something about wetlands. Hopefully you won't find it to be too much of a snooze fest in the middle. You know, there's some details that we're going to get down to here. So hopefully it will be informative, and make sure that somebody confirm that you all can see my screen. Can somebody give me a thumbs up or a yes?
You're good. Looks great.
Perfect. Thank you. So again, my name is Pam Mason, and I am at VIMS, and I've worked in the section that's called the Center for Coastal Resources Management. Prior to that name of the section, it was actually called the Wetlands Program. So I've been there working at VIMS for about 30 years. Most of my professional career, I spent a hot minute in Richmond on 2 different occasions, but I prefer the coast. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about wetlands, sort of benefits and ecosystem services, sort of the things of why wetlands are so important for our society, and based on some of the benefits and the way that they play roles in the landscape. So first, I'm going to start with the basics. This is the wetland definition. This wetland definition is actually written in Virginia Code, and you'll probably hear more about the legal bits from the next speaker. So wetlands are areas that are inundated, saturated by groundwater. So there's one of our things is water, at frequency and duration sufficient to support and under normal conditions. So in other words, typically a prevalence of vegetation that is adapted to living in saturated soil conditions. And then there's some common names. Wetlands generally include swamps, marshes, bogs, and similar areas. I will note that this definition basically reflects the scientific understanding and is not a jurisdictional determination definition. And I just added that, for this talk today. Previously, I would not have necessarily put that on this slide, but it seems like it might be needed right now in the current era. So the next piece I want to just touch real quick on is ecosystem services. So ecosystem services it's pretty simple, components of nature directly enjoyed, consumed, or used to yield human well-being. That's just one definition. There are a whole bunch. I like this one because it's really simple. It's just, what do humans benefit from nature's services? So it keeps it really simple. So next, I want to go into some of the specific ecosystem services that wetlands provide. You may also know ecosystem services, a term of sometimes people call valuation or benefits. Sometimes those terms are equated specifically with dollar signs, and sometimes they aren't, but sometimes they're used interchangeably. So if you're reading or looking at material or seeing something online and you see something about a valuation or a benefit, that may or may not have a dollar sign associated with it, but it's talking about ecosystem services. So some of the ones I'm going to go over are listed on the slide. I'm not going to read them to you, because I'm going to go through some next slides and explain some of those elements. So the other thing is, on these slides, I periodically have pictures of pretty wetlands from Virginia. The picture in the bottom right is very interesting because this may or may not be a wetland that would no longer be jurisdictional in Virginia. It's possible it wouldn't. You can see that this photo is probably taken in August, and some of our wetlands in the middle of the summer, despite that's our time of highest rainfall, are typically almost dry at the surface, even if the soil is saturated. But what you see here is a lot of water lines on trees that look like they're just dry trees, but this is actually a photo of a wetland. So one of the big services that we appreciate as humans is wetlands improve water quality. So sediment, nutrients, and other pollutants, including toxicants and bacteria, can be filtered from surface runoff, groundwater, and tidal water flow. And so a lot of people talk about filter, and they use an analogy of coffee filters. It's a pretty good analogy. So I have a little photo of a coffee filter there. Specifically, some of the ways that wetlands do this is wetland vegetation can disrupt wave energy and water flow quantity and quality. And so by doing that, it can minimize the erosion of the upland area that the wetland is in front of. And that could be for tidal and non-tidal wetlands. Most of these processes are actually true for tidal and non-tidal wetlands. There's sometimes some variation in how that process works based on the landscape in which the wetland sits. And so obviously tidal wetlands have tides, non-tidal wetlands just have free-flowing water. So there's some differences there, but the actions and the functions of those wetlands tend to be comparable between tidal and non-tidal wetlands. So one of the next ones is nutrient removal. And again, both tidal and non-tidal wetlands are highly efficient at removing nutrients. And there's lots of reasons for that. And I'll add a little bit more detail over the next slides. So wetlands can also act as sediment sinks or basins. So again, sometimes the nutrients are associated with soil particles. So when wetlands trap sediments, they also can trap additional nutrients, especially phosphorus. So what happens is the vegetation slows the flow of the water, and that is a big portion of how then vegetated wetlands control or minimize nutrient discharge in the waterway and control sediment discharge into the waterway. So why is water quality in need of improvement? So I went and grabbed the latest water quality assessment integrated report. This is a report that's produced with Department of Environmental Quality as the lead and Department of Conservation and Recreation as a partner. And the estimate is that water quality in nearly 75% of Virginia's tidal waters, and that's the one I focused on for this, is impaired due to a variety of pollutants. We also have impaired non-tidal waters, and that average is a little bit less because we have a lot more linear miles of non-tidal waters. And so the percentage of impairment is lower, but there are also non-tidal impairments. So, and pollutants, what's the problem with pollutants? Why is that an issue? So again, I'm focusing here on tidal wetlands, and this crosswalks again with tidal and non-tidal wetlands, but the pollutants affect the aquatic life and the wildlife in the wetlands. So most animals that spend time in wetlands, and there's quite a few that spend portions or large portions of their life, or there's even some endemic species, which means they really live almost entirely in wetlands. So if they eat the vegetation, or they're more likely to eat microbes or small fish or bugs, basically, that eat the vegetation or the breakdown products of the vegetation, they are going to ingest then the nutrients and or the toxicants and or the bacteria that's in there. And so then that can have an adverse effect on that wildlife, and obviously then up the food chain to us if we then eat the fish or shellfish that come from those waters. And then the second really important element of pollutants is drinking water. So drinking source water is a very important issue in Virginia. We are considered to be a water wealthy, we have a lot of water in Virginia, and yet we have some risks to our water from surface pollution and from saltwater intrusion. And so having a drinking water source that is lacking that it does not have toxicants or heavy metals or bacteria is really critical. And so the wetlands that can help provide those services in our landscape without us having to basically buy or pay or engineer those surfaces is a huge benefit. Slide is a little bit off the screen. Sorry about that. I'm going to go back. Try to go back. There we go. So one last one on vegetation. So this is showing, again, a tidal shoreline, but this could also be a non-tidal shoreline. So the runoff from the surface towards the waterway would be an example of how a non-tidal wetland might intercept pollutants. And then if that wetland is also along the shoreline, but also a tidal wetland, then it can reduce the flood and ebb tide. So you can just sort of see graphically that the runoff that is laden with sediment and maybe attached nutrients gets filtered and becomes cleaner as it reaches the waterway. And the same is true as flood tides come into the wetlands. And the wetlands slow the flow of the water. Some of the sediment and the particulates that are have pollution associated with them settle into the surface of the wetland. And then when the water leaves the wetland, it's cleaner than when it came in. So I'm going to switch now to a second major ecosystem service or benefit of wetlands, and that is primary productivity. So there is this sort of fact that may or may not be known out there by some folks, but you may have heard this, that salt marshes are considered to be as productive or potentially more productive on an annual basis than tropical rainforests. And part of this is because the dense grasses that grow in our tidal marshes produce a lot of organic matter. And in tropical rainforests, there's a lot of organic matter, but it's stored in in permanent woody vegetation. So this is an annual production. But what it basically means is that these marshes and a lot of other non-tidal wetlands as well create a whole lot of vegetative material out of the carbon and the nitrogen and the phosphorus that they take out of the system. So they're taking, if those are nutrified systems, they're removing those nutrients, they're turning it into vegetative material. The vegetative material then supports a food chain. So this is an example specifically for tidal marshes, but tidal marshes produce these grasses. The grasses are not particularly edible. They're high in cellulose, which is a very fibrous material. So few things directly graze on the grass. However, the grass starts to decay, is imported and exported out into the waterway. And while it's decaying, it creates the surface of the decaying material gets covered in microorganisms, and then filter feeders like marsh snails and worms and fiddler crabs and shrimp and plankton and menhaden and anything that oysters, clams, anything that filters water are using some of the microorganisms and the bacteria and the algae that are attached to that vegetative decaying material, and they use that as a food source. And so it just cycles in and provides that. And then obviously as it goes up the food chain, the smaller things that are the filter feeders then become food for the things that we like to eat and catch, like striped bass and blue crabs and maybe even coastal shrimp, now that they're not just North Carolina shrimp, and we now call them coastal or East Coast shrimp. So marsh habitat, the next big feature that we value marshes for. So marshes and wetlands provide a lot of shelter and nursery areas, and this can be for insects, birds, fish, and crustaceans. Obviously, a lot of these things like to consume other things, like the birds like to eat the fish and crustaceans and the insects, and some of the fish also eat some of the insects and some of the little crustaceans. So, again, there's the whole food web. But what happens is those marshes with their dense vegetation and the non-tidal wetlands that have dense forage and vegetation, a lot of those areas produce a lot of this life and small forage foods, and that provides then shelter and habitat. Wading birds, mammals, muskrats, otters, all can find shelter and hiding places in marshes. Beavers, which are not on my slide, but we talk about quite a bit. Beavers had originally been extirpated from Virginia, which meant that they were hunted to the point of relative extinction locally. And they are coming back, and they actually are being attributed with some of our larger scale wetland restoration is not human at all. It's beaver produced wetlands. So they are actually providing an additional, the beavers are creating a habitat for themselves, but also then providing habitat, additional wetland habitat for other Virginian denizens. And then obviously one of the other things is, as I pointed out, when these marshes are providing these initial benefits, as it goes up the food chain, then that supports recreational fisheries, commercial fisheries, and all kinds of other recreational and activity benefits. All right, looks like it cut off the tops of my picture. So again, this is just a really pretty illustration that sort of shows some of the critters that are commonly found and or live in wetlands and spend much of their time. The mummy chog on the bottom, or what's known as the minnow, spends almost all of its time in wetlands. Blue crabs spend their larval and juvenile time in wetlands. Summer and winter flounders spend a lot of their juvenile life stages in wetlands. So I'm going to switch now to talk a little bit about flood and flood regulation. So this is just a really nice graphic. So it's an old one, but it explains it really well. It just sort of shows how when we have wetlands in the system, the wetlands do a couple things. They can, as I said, they can address water quantity and flow rate, and then quantity. So if the wetlands are there, a lot of times folks say that they act like sponges. So a lot of the non-tidal and the higher marsh tidal wetlands that don't have soil saturated all the time, those soils are highly permeable. And so when the rain falls, the rain and typically the wetlands are in the low elevations within the landscape, so that the places that the rain is going to flow to, and then they can store those wetlands. And so There have actually been some studies on larger scales where you can look at the peak flood and the speed at the flood rate, and where you have wetlands in that place, then you get lower flood crests and lower flow rates. So that's an attribute that's highly valuable, especially right now, where we have our changing climate and our different rain events coming faster and stronger and delivering additional rain at really high rates, like New York City flooded the other day. New York City don't have very many wetlands. Maybe it would have been a little bit better if they had some. And I just grabbed this very recently, borrowed paper from Al-Atabi and from 2023, and it sort of shows what this could look like. And this was a peak flood simulated from Hurricane Ike. So this is part of coastal, this is Galveston Bay, so this is coastal Texas. And the darkest blue colors are the highest in the first panel, are the highest peak flood heights. And then the second panel, and that would be what it would look like if they had taken out all of the wetlands in the panel A, the first panel on the left. The second panel in the middle is the baseline. That's sort of the existing condition. And you can see that the peak flood, it's a little less high in some of those areas than it would be with no wetlands. And then in the panel C is the difference. So if you knew, if they modeled Galveston Bay with no wetlands, and you get these peak flood heights, so this is water level above surface elevation, and then they put the wetlands back in and look at the actual condition, the baseline condition, the change, what is modified by the existing wetlands is shown in the last panel. And so that you can see that there's significant difference from the presence of the wetlands in terms of the actual flooding water elevation. So the big dark blob, for instance, in the back that's over 4 feet, part of it's less than 4 feet. And then when you look at the blob in the final panel, the wetlands, existence of those wetlands have modified that flood height elevation by about 1/2 foot. So another great attribute of wetlands is aesthetics and education. So a lot of folks really enjoy wetlands. This is one where tidal, non-tidal wetlands can be very different. Tidal wetlands tend to be vast expanses of marsh grasses that look like meadows. And so that's one kind of aesthetic, whereas non-tidal wetlands, because they don't have to deal with salt, have very much, they have a greater diversity in plants. And so non-tidal wetlands commonly have vegetative plants that produce really pretty flowers, which a lot of people like to observe. They both support a lot of bird activity. And so bird watching is a very popular recreational activity that occurs in wetlands. And wetlands are also used as a place to talk about bird species and marine aquatic species and floods, flood issues and all those sorts of things that we talk about in our environment. The picture I have right here happens to be a little schematic of Charles Brown Park, which is in your county. And it was originally created for a stormwater facility, but they took advantage of the fact that they were going to build it explicitly, partly as a stormwater facility and partly as an educational wetland. So it's a non-tidal, so it has at certain times of the year some really beautiful flowers and birds in there, and people can see crayfish. And they built a walking path around it and put signage so you can learn about the systems that you're observing. So I have a couple last slides here. I hope I'm not going too far. So wetlands are estimated to support about 43% of federally threatened endangered species. And again, this is either direct or non-direct. Now, I will note that some of these more enigmatic species don't occur in Virginia, like the Florida panther and the whooping crane. But the swamp pink and the cane bee's dropwort, I pulled off the list because those are specifically found in Virginia, and those happen to be rare and threatened plant species. So the point being is that a lot of coastal and inner and not just coastal, a lot of the species that are wildlife species in the United States are dependent one way or another on wetlands for some portion of their life cycle. Wetland status. So it's been estimated that Virginia has lost about 6,000 acres just between 56 and 77, which was one of the most recent data points we have. We have not been very good about doing wetland status and trends in Virginia. Even though we now have the capacity to do it much more efficiently with remote sense data, we need to go back and sort of revisit. Much of that wetland loss was from urban development and dredging projects, at least in the tidal wetlands. In non-tidal wetlands, most of it is development and road projects. So historically, colonially, I will add that the previous estimate for loss rate was about 50% of Virginia's wetlands. And I would point out, for instance, that the Dismal Swamp is mapped. It exists currently. The mapped extent is about 50% of what it was historically. Much of southern Chesapeake, parts of Virginia Beach, and parts of North Carolina were in what was historically the Dismal Swamp, were drained and became farmland. Drained wetlands make great farmland because they have a lot of organic material and still probably moisture in the soil, so the crops do well in drained wetlands. Unfortunately for the wetlands, but perhaps fortunately for the crops. Virginia's wetland status today, we have an estimate about 1 million acres of wetlands, and of that 20% or so are tidal and about 80% are non-tidal. And the majority of these wetlands are located in the urban crescent between DC to Norfolk. That's problematic because that's also where about 60% of the population of Virginia is. So that conflict continues to cause risk for wetland loss. Just wanted to show really quickly what that looks like on a map. So all these little green specks, and you can see the Dismal Swamp down there standing loud and proud, are tidal and non-tidal wetlands. This is NWI data, and I've pulled it from Adapt Virginia. So if you ever want to look around at wetlands and see what's in your backyard, that's a good resource. And you can see again that most of the wetlands you can see, so the Route 95 line, and there's a lot of reasons for that I'm not going to go into, but many of our wetlands are in the coastal plain. Not all of them. This is a highlight again from Adapt Virginia, but now I'm showing just tidal wetlands. Well, I'm showing tidal wetlands and non-tidal wetlands, so you can get a sense of where obviously our tidal wetlands are along our tidal waterways, and then you can see where the non-tidal wetlands are. So we have quite a diverse and diffuse distribution of wetlands. Most of them in the coastal plain. All of our tidal wetlands are in the coastal plain, but we do have wetlands throughout the state. And some of the smaller wetlands and some of the headwater areas are at some of the higher risk for loss due to development or conversion. I wanted to leave you with a little something to think about. So if you want to do work on wetlands, what do you want to do? Well, you can put one in your yard. Soil and water conservation districts provide cost share for Virginia Conservation Assistance Program. So you could try that, or you could ask a nonprofit. You could talk to CBF. Shoreline property owners are more likely to have suitable conditions for a living shoreline, which would be a tidal marsh. If that was more of your interest, that's something to think about. You could always help build wetlands other places. You could join with other project implementers. There are a lot of folks doing work on wetlands right now. Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources actively works in wetlands, river and watershed groups. And a lot of times they're looking for volunteers. So when they're doing their projects, one of the things they like to get is citizens that are interested in wetlands out there, and of course you can participate in the process around wetlands and wetland decision making. That's always a good idea. So that's my last slide, and here's my contact information if anybody would like to follow up with any questions. And I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Pam. I think we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I just want to highlight, folks, that if you have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we're going to take a couple of now before the next presentation, and then we will have some time at the end for some additional questions. But Pam, first we have a couple of questions from Anastasia on the topics of marsh grasses, and so it's sort of a two-parter. What happens to our wetlands as we see accelerated marsh grass die off, and what can folks do, or how can Virginia help the grasses be restored?
That's a great question. So some of the marsh die off is Well, originally there was some debate over what was causing that, and there are potentially lots of reasons for marsh grass die off. Believe it or not, one of them is marsh snails. But we generally think that most of the die off is related to the areas that are maybe more towards the middle of marshes. At least that's where it's occurring on the Eastern Shore and Queens Creek and in Williamsburg and parts of York County. And what we think is going on there is that it's really just it's sea level rise. And so marshes have this relationship between where they live relative to how much water saturation they can deal with. And basically the plants, so this picture right here is low marsh, so that's Spartina alterniflora, and it can tolerate being underwater about half a day, just on average, half a day, 12 hours a day. So that means the other 12-hour day, the water needs to be out away from the plant so the plant can respire. They need to breathe. And when they can't breathe, they drown. And so some of the areas that are in the center of our marshes just don't have enough sediment supply. And so they're basically sort of locally sinking, and the water is kind of locally higher in some places. Marshes have always had areas of open water. Typically our larger marshes have always had areas of open water we call pans. And so sometimes when those areas get drier, the vegetation grows in them, and now that they're lower, the vegetation is dying back. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot to do about that. There is an opportunity to potentially restore that particular marsh, by increasing the sediment elevation. And we can do that by adding clean sediment and literally raising the surface of the marsh to buy that distance between the saturated water soils and where the marsh plants sit. So that's one option. Some people refer to it as thin layer deposition. There's research now on thick layer deposition. So the scientists are still looking into which is preferential. Just go ahead and load a lot of sediment on top of a marsh and let the marsh work its way up through, or do you just put a little bit of amount? And we know that we're just buying time against sea level rise. So it's a complicated issue. In terms of helping, I think one of the ways that we're trying to help is by doing notably two things. First is marsh restoration and creation wherever we can. So hence the encouragement for people to do living shorelines, because if they're going to manage their shoreline anyway, at least we can get some marsh maybe out of it. We can get a little bit of a net resource gain and all the ecosystem benefits for the public trust resource, for the waterway, and for the folks that use the waterway and the critters that live there. The other thing is to try to ensure that marshes, as they move into the landscape, because they will be moving landward in response to sea level rise, as the leading edges drown out, they will go back to where, so the marsh plant will literally sit, I should have shown a cross section, will literally sit between mean tide and mean high water is where the low marsh sits. And then from mean high water to edge of tide is where the high marsh sits. And so the marshes will move back in the landscape where they can. So where the slopes are flat enough and where folks do not prevent that from happening. And so one way to get involved is actually to work with folks that are looking for policy and projects on allowing for marsh migration, because we're not necessarily going to be able to save the marshes where they sit now. And so we want to focus that energy and that effort from our volunteers and our interested marsh people on looking for marshes to persist over time. So I know that's not quite as interesting of an idea as just replanting grass, but then there's nothing wrong with planting grass as long as you think it's in a place where it will last for a while.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Let's see. We have another question from Janet, and she said, can you address the practice of wetlands mitigation?
Interesting term, practice. So wetlands mitigation is called compensatory mitigation. And so it's based on the federal sequencing law that the state adopted, which is avoid, minimize, and mitigate or compensate. So when a project is proposed that impacts a wetland, the first thing that the project proponent is supposed to prove to the project reviewers, so the permitting authorities, be it the federal or the state, because we both use sequencing. It's the 401(b)(3), whatever section of the Clean Water Act. But anyway, so the first thing is you want to show that that the impacts of the wetlands that you are seeking a permit for, that you've avoided most of what you can. So an example might be, developing a local road, although that's VDOT, that's a little complicated. Let's say you're developing a commercial structure and you have a 5-acre lot and you have a 1/2 acre of wetlands on the lot. Well, you really probably should be able to develop that commercial structure without impacting the wetland at all. So let's say you have a 3-acre lot and a 1.5 acre wetland, and you're still trying to do that same commercial development. Well, then your idea would be to perhaps orient the building or the infrastructure and its supporting like roads and parking, orient those maybe in a clever or creative way so that you have the least amount of impacts. Then finally, the impacts that you can't avoid, if you're issued the permit and there's a public trust interest where we're supposed to weigh the private benefits to the private and public benefits against the private and public detriment. So let's say your project is deemed acceptable and you get a permit, then the impacts that you have to the wetlands are supposed to be compensated for. And in compensation, there's several ways to do it. So one way is to rebuild what wetlands you've destroyed right on site. And by and large, that's not a real common one. Not for commercial development. For shoreline erosion, like for people that are doing conventional, that's a little bit more potentially feasible. So that leaves us with our other two options. One is offsite banking or offsite building. You can either do that again individually, but most people don't do those individual projects. Most people purchase a comparable aerial extent from a bank. So a bank is a wetland that was created by a fiscal agent that is interested in making money selling wetlands. And so they go through the upfront financial risk of building a wetland, be it tidal or non-tidal. Then they get reviewed by a team that includes state and federal partners, this interagency review team, the IRT. The IRT verifies how many credits they can sell, and then they bank them. They sell those credits. The final option for compensation is in lieu fees, and that's where you may or may not have a bank in your hydrologic unit that you're impacting your wetland in. You're only supposed to be able to buy banking credits in either that hydrologic unit or one adjacent. So it gets complicated actually, but nevertheless, if that's not possible, you can pay money at the determined rate for wetlands replacement for the area you've impacted. And there is the Aquatic Resources Trust Fund that's run by the Nature Conservancy, and DEQ also has its own in lieu fee fund. So do individual counties and cities have in lieu fee funds for tidal wetlands. And it's unfortunate because the in lieu fees are money in a bank, not wetlands on the ground, which is originally what the idea of compensation was for. In order to meet our state commitment and our federal commitment to no net loss of wetlands. This is how we manage those times where wetlands are going to be impacted, and then we need to offset those so that we have a zero balance. We have no net loss of wetlands. That's the theory. I hope I explained that question. I could talk for hours on mitigation. I did my research on mitigation. But
you did an incredible job explaining a very dense topic. I think many of us that have been in this work for a long time really appreciate the skill you have in unpacking an otherwise very obtuse topic. So thank you. I do know we're going to get ready to shift to the next presentation, but I did want to ask one final question to, in some ways, sort of tee Jonathan up a little bit. And that's, he is going to be talking about the potential consequences of the Sackett decision. And that did offer a new definition at the federal level for what constitutes wetlands. You have touched on a lot of the ecosystem services that we see from our tidal wetlands, as well as some of the non-tidal, but if you could sort of spell it out in like an elevator pitch for people of what those non-tidal wetlands ecosystem services are, so they understand what is at risk in this next presentation, I think that would be great.
Sure. So probably the largest, most significant ecosystem service of non-tidal wetlands is water quality, actually. So scientists that study water quality and load reduction, specifically relative to Chesapeake Bay concerns, note that headwaters, so as streams go upstream, we give them orders of magnitude, so we call them numbers. And so where the water first starts to form a stream and it goes from intermittent to some sort of permanent flow, we call that a first order stream. We also use the term headwaters because it's at the head of the waters. And if you've ever been to Highland County, Virginia, there's a town called Headwaters. Just a fun fact for you to know. So the headwaters is the beginning of the system. And it's also the first place that then a huge area of the watersheds load into those headwaters. So they're basically also the first line of defense. And because they tend to be drier, because they may not be connected directly to a waterway, or they might be on an intermittent stream that isn't permanent flow year round, those are some of the wetlands that are likely to would lose being defined as a wetland under the Sackett decision. So I think water quality is one of the biggest. There are many others. They are typically home to a lot of our rare and endangered or waterways that are home to a rare and endangered like mussel species that we have in Virginia. They may or may not support brook trout and some of those kinds of fresh flowing species. And then the isolated ponds that you may know as Carolina ponds or Grafton ponds or Carolina bays, or we have those systems in Virginia as well, and they're highly valued for their diversity, uniqueness of ecosystem diversity, especially around amphibians and reptiles, and those also. So the isolated and the headwater wetlands are the ones that would probably fall out and from the definition impacts. I hope that worked.
Thank you so much. I think that's perfect tee up for Jonathan. And I think, Jonathan, let me go ahead and introduce you and just remind your folks that we use the Q&A function. We will have some time at the end. And so let's get going with Jonathan. He is a staff attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center in Charlottesville, Virginia. Since joining SELC in 2015, he has worked on coal ash litigation, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and federal advocacy and outreach efforts aimed at upholding federal clean water and wetlands protections, in addition to working to protect water quality and wetlands here in Virginia. Jonathan, similar to Pam, is one of our favorite people because he is fighting for all of the right things, as you just heard. Jonathan, please, or everyone, please join me in the silent applause for Jonathan, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the Sackett decision specifically.
Thanks, Jay. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, can you see my slides?
We can.
Great. All right, well, thanks for having me here to talk with you today. You know, we're here to talk about Virginia's wetlands and Virginia's wetland protections. So I'm going to talk about sort of two buckets of things. One is Federal Clean Water Act protections for wetlands and clean water in general, and the other being Virginia's state law protections for Virginia's wetlands. I'm going to talk about some interactions between those two things, and as Jay mentioned, a Supreme Court case that came out, the opinion came out in May of this year, called Sackett v. EPA. And I'm going to talk about how that does and does not affect protections for wetlands in Virginia. And if there's one thing you take away from my talk, well, you should take away from Pam's talk the importance of wetlands, and I hope you take away from my talk the importance of Virginia's protections for its wetlands. But if there's one other thing, it would be that the Sackett decision does not directly implicate or affect Virginia's state protections that it has adopted as state law for Virginia wetlands. And I'll complicate that a bit, but I'll explain, so just bear with me. So first, let me just explain what this Supreme Court case is about. The Sacketts are a couple in Idaho. This was actually their second trip to the Supreme Court of the United States on the same issue. They started developing a home site adjacent to across a road from Priest Lake in northern Idaho, which is sometimes called Idaho's crown jewel. It's a beautiful lake. They were building a second home on a home site there that contained wetlands. They began excavating, they began filling the wetlands. Let me show you, here's their parcel. So you can see labeled in the photo there, Sackett Wetlands, and then you can see a road, some homes, and then the lake. Those wetlands were connected to the lake by a sort of a pre-existing wetland complex that had then been developed. They received a letter from the EPA saying you are filling wetlands that are waters of the United States, and you need to stop and you need to restore them. That waters of the United States term is really important for the Federal Clean Water Act, because the Clean Water Act says that it applies to and protects waters of the United States. But the statute, the language in the Clean Water Act, it doesn't define that term. So it was left to the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers to define by regulation what is within that definition of waters of the United States that receives federal Clean Water Act protections. That includes rivers and streams and lakes, and also wetlands, but a big question being what wetlands. So here's another picture of the site. You can see it's pretty wet, looks like wetlands, and it's been filled in. There's some excavation equipment there. So this question, what is protected by the Federal Clean Water Act? These are sort of the positions taken in the Sackett case by the various parties. So first you have the United States, the federal government, saying, you know, wetlands that are adjacent to a tributary, a stream that's clearly jurisdictional under the law, should be covered where, taken together with other similarly situated wetlands, they are significantly affecting the integrity of a traditional navigable water. So if you think traditional navigable waters like the James River, or like a large tributary of the James River, or the Chesapeake Bay, some of our larger lakes, these are all traditionally navigable waters. The amici, that's a Latin term for friends of the court, who supported briefs in support of the Sackett, said that the wetlands should have a continuous surface connection to a relatively permanent water. And that's sort of the Scalia opinion from another Supreme Court case you may have heard of from 2008 called Rapanos. Or 2006, excuse me. And then the Sacketts themselves said the wetlands should be directly on the shoreline of a navigable, in fact, water. So only a water body that you could, in fact, sail a ship or a boat on, and the wetlands should be directly on the shoreline of that water. And I'll just go back to say, you probably could take away from Pam's talk the diversity of different types of wetlands and how important they are functioning together, but that, not every wetland is directly on the shoreline of a navigable, in fact, water. So what did the Supreme Court hold? Interestingly, all 9 justices agreed on the outcome of the case, which was that the wetlands on the Sackett's property in Idaho were not jurisdictional, were not protected by the Federal Clean Water Act. So all 9 justices agreed on that. Where they differed was on the rationale for that decision. So Justice Alito, writing for the majority, said the Clean Water Act covers wetlands with a continuous surface connection to a relatively permanent body of water, like a stream, an ocean, a river, a lake, so that the wetlands are practically indistinguishable from that larger body of water. My understanding is that from a scientific perspective, that's pretty difficult to tease out. Also, the court didn't define those terms that you see in quotes there. Justice Kavanaugh wrote a concurrence, but disagreed about how to construe Clean Water Act jurisdiction. He said that the test departed from the text of the Clean Water Act and disregarded the ordinary meaning of adjacent. And Justice Kagan, thinking similarly, said the court was substituting its own ideas about policymaking for Congress's. The objective of the Clean Water Act, which is in the language of the law, is to restore and maintain the chemical, biological, and physical integrity of the nation's waters. That's a pretty large charge. The EPA has estimated after the Sackett decision came out that the decision potentially would eliminate Clean Water Act protections for 63% of wetlands nationwide and for 4.9 million miles of streams nationwide. So even though the case pertained to a specific property and the holding in the case was, about what waters or what wetlands rather are protected by the Clean Water Act, the way that the court wrote its opinion has wider implications for wetlands and other waters in terms of what is protected under the Clean Water Act. So nothing in the Sackett decision, though, has any direct implication for state protections for wetlands or for clean water generally. Virginia participates through a structure called federalism in implementing the Federal Clean Water Act. So Virginia and the Department of Environmental Quality are basically partners with EPA and the Corps of Engineers in implementing the Clean Water Act. And certain authorities under the Clean Water Act are delegated to Virginia DEQ to implement. So for instance, if you have a factory and you're discharging pollutants from a pipe into a stream or a river, you'll have to get a permit in order to do that. That permit is both a state permit, the Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, and serves as your federal Clean Water Act permit. It's issued by Virginia DEQ. Independently of that, Virginia has its own protections for clean water and for wetlands. So I'd like to talk with you some about what some of those are. Number one, we have the state water control law. It's a rather sprawling statute in terms of dealing with a lot of different issues that come up when you're talking about water quality. But it has been around since 1946. It's been amended quite a few times. The Clean Water Act's only been around since 1972. The state water control law defines state waters to mean all water on the surface and under the ground, including wetlands. Now, that including wetlands was added in 2001 by the Virginia Non-Tidal Wetlands Act. And this is legislation that was adopted by a large majority of the General Assembly, a bipartisan majority, I would add. It was signed into law by a Republican governor as well, and it incorporated wetlands protections into the state water control law, and it gave DEQ the authority to regulate impacts to wetlands in order to protect them. And that was in large part in response to in retrospect, after Sackett, smaller scale failure of the federal government to protect wetlands that had serious impacts in Virginia. Virginia was concerned that its wetlands were being left unprotected by the federal regime under the Clean Water Act, and were also not adequately protected. The non-tidal wetlands, at least, were not adequately protected by state law. And so you see this this Non-Tidal Wetlands Act adopted by the General Assembly, signed into law. So that's been the state of play in Virginia for over 2 decades now. The way that Virginia implements those protections, broadly speaking, is to require a Virginia water protection permit before excavating or filling wetlands and streams. So this is a sort of an analog of the federal Section 404 permit under the Clean Water Act that the Corps of Engineers implements, but it arises from state law, and the scope of it is defined by state law. It is not defined by the Federal Clean Water Act, by the Supreme Court ruling on the Federal Clean Water Act. And as Pam explained so well, better than I could, certainly, I wish she would teach a CLE on it. That program requires avoidance and then minimization and then mitigation of impacts to wetlands if a permit's granted, in order to meet the Commonwealth's goal of no net loss of wetlands. And in fact, I think the Commonwealth has an additional aspiration to actually have a net increase in the wetlands in Virginia. So just to reiterate one more time, these protections are independent from the Federal Clean Water Act. They don't depend on the definition of waters of the United States. The Sackett decision on its face has no impact whatsoever on protections for wetlands in Virginia. So you might be wondering, okay, why are we here? Besides learning about the importance of wetlands, why is this webinar titled Defending Virginia's Wetlands? And the reason for that is that opening such a broad gap, or so much daylight between the sort of federal floor, if you will, for wetlands protections, and the federal protections and the Virginia protections were pretty close. Then after Sackett, the bottom has fallen out of the Federal Clean Water Act, unfortunately, in terms of the scope of wetlands that it is protecting. It truly unprecedented in the 50-year history of the Clean Water Act. There is now a much greater incentive to weaken Virginia's critical protections for Virginia's wetlands under state law. And so that's a big concern, and something that I think we all should be alert to and concerned about should something like that be proposed. So, I won't retread the ground that Pam has covered, but these non-tidal wetlands that are in many cases no longer covered by the Federal Clean Water Act, but are still protected by Virginia law, provide so many things that we all rely on. They sequester floodwater, or lessen the sort of flashiness of streams by absorbing some rainfall. They can directly absorb some floodwaters where wetlands are along the banks of an overflowing river or stream. They filter pollution. Not that wetlands are the solution to pollution, but they certainly help. That helps do things like help us recover the Chesapeake Bay. Wetlands are a really important way of preventing sediment and nutrients from flowing off the land and downstream through rivers and streams, ultimately to the bay. Also, 3 out of 4 Virginians get their drinking water from surface water, and that source water, the water quality is protected in part by non-tidal wetlands, doing things like holding in pollution. The habitat for fish and wildlife. Pam talked quite a bit about that. If you're interested in economics, in 2011, I'm sorry I don't have a more recent figure. I'm sure it's only grown since then, but the Fish and Wildlife Service found that that $1.1 billion was spent on recreational fishing in Virginia. I found that number really striking. And we talked a little bit about the figures for what wetlands would lose protections, the scale of the loss nationally. But I can also share with you that VIMS, and I'll put a caveat there that this is an initial estimate, and I am not a scientific expert, but there are lots of questions of interpretation of data. But in VIM's judgment, as an initial estimate, Virginia has about 850,000 acres of non-tidal wetlands, and they've found that of those, about 1/3 might likely not meet the post-Sackett definition of waters of the United States under the Clean Water Act. So that includes over 150,000 acres that are considered isolated, and 100,000 acres of headwaters wetlands that are really critical for the functions that Pam talked about in terms of the importance of these non-tidal wetlands in Virginia and for the Chesapeake Bay especially. One other thing I should mention, which I talked a little bit about how Virginia implements the sort of point source discharge program under the Clean Water Act, but the Corps of Engineers continues to implement the federal Section 404 dredge and fill program that regulates impacts to wetlands. That's common. I want to make sure you know that. Only a few states have done what is called assumed the 404 program, the federal program. I think Florida and New Jersey, maybe Michigan. It's rare. It's very common for the Corps to implement that program, and then the state implements its own program if it has one, as we're lucky to have here in Virginia. It does look like there's a potential proposal from DEQ to ask for funding to assume the federal program. That's something that would have to go through a process at EPA. But that is something that is worth looking out for as well. In general, states don't have the resources at the environmental agency or the staff or the expertise to implement the federal program. And in this case, we're really looking to Virginia to fill the gap that's already been left by the constriction of federal jurisdiction. So much that the federal government was protecting, we could rely on the Corps of Engineers as a backstop. It will likely no longer be protecting in Virginia. And so Virginia is on its own in that respect. I think that Virginia will have its hands full making sure it can meet its obligations to do that. And I think it would be quite difficult to take on the entire federal program as well, diminished as it is. So, what can you do? You can talk to your friends and family about everything you've learned about how important wetlands are and how important it is that we maintain the critical state law protections that Virginia has wisely adopted to protect its wetlands, including non-tidal wetlands. And you can also talk with your local and state officials, including legislators, about how important those wetlands and protecting them are. So thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And again, if you all want to use the Q&A function, you can do that. But I see we have someone with their hand up. And so, Jackie, if it's easier, we'll just go ahead and unmute you, and you can ask your question verbally.
Jackie, if you're still there, you're unmuted. Okay.
Right.
Maybe that was an accident. Okay.
Say Jackie is still reeling from the potential ramifications of Jonathan's speech. So if you come back, Jackie, we'll be ready. Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand or use the Q&A. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. I certainly learned a lot listening to both you and Pam. It's always a pleasure to uh, really get into the weeds on this topic. And I think it was made abundantly clear that what we're talking about, were we to change Virginia's wetlands laws to adopt the federal standard, is a massive blow to our natural resources and environment. And so I really appreciate the information you both provided, and hope that everyone is carrying with them the import of these ecosystems and a bit of motivation to weigh in with their legislators. Luckily, we're going to make that easier because everyone that is in here and signed up, you will receive an email from us that includes a wetlands defense postcard. It is a really easy way for you to let your senator and delegate know that this is an important issue for you. And I know a lot of this material may have been dense. It's a lot coming at you at once, but that's a reflection of how important these ecosystems are. So one of the things that, main takeaway you need to keep in mind is we're really asking legislators to not do anything. It doesn't get any more simple than that. Just don't make any changes. We have a good system in Virginia. And if nothing else sticks with you, please keep that in mind when you are having conversations with your legislators, that Virginia's wetlands are too important for us to start potentially rolling back protections that we have on the books. I also did want to highlight that Jonathan made reference to Virginia's aspirational goals around wetlands. For those of you that have been with us in Bay Foundation land for some time, you will know that part of the Bay Agreement is that we would actually increase the number of wetlands over time, enhance and restore wetlands to the tune of 85,000 acres around the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We are woefully behind in that goal, but I think we can all agree reducing the protections on wetlands would be a terrible step in the wrong direction. So I want to thank you all so much for giving us your evening and giving your attention to these wonderful speakers, to Pam and Jonathan. We at CBF really are so grateful for both your expertise and your partnership in protecting our wetlands, and you will hear from us soon. Thank you all.
Yep. Oh, did you see we happen to have, just if people want to stay on for a couple more minutes, we do have 2 questions that popped in while you were closing.
Oh, great. All right. Bridget, I see we have an article from you, and thank you very much. Kale is another trusted partner on this issue, and we will certainly make that available to folks. Marina, I'm going to throw this question out to both Jonathan and Pam, whoever wants to answer. Regulators seem to be very willing to accept the in lieu fees as mitigation. Any suggestions for opposing that?
I'll start. So in lieu fee in state law is the last option. So I think if you want to be smart, you just show up with the list in order and try to promote them selecting one of the previous choices on the list. I mean, it's ordered intentionally. I mean, it literally says first do this, second do that, and last go to in lieu fee. So the other thing is you could push on folks to follow up with the folks that run the in lieu fee and encourage them to actually do some projects with it. Jonathan has another idea, but
Yeah, no, that sounds good to me.
Marina, I see your hand is up. Do you have a follow-up question? You are unmuted. All right, that is the end of the questions we have in here. I also do want to highlight that Anne has put a NPR article in the chat, and we will make that available. But it was was on NPR today, very timely because it talks about spongy cities, as Pam was talking about. Perhaps if there was more wetlands in some of our built environments, they would be more resilient to these flood events. And so, interesting and timely read, and encourage folks to take a look. Once again, thank
Yeah,
you.
I just want to say, I also dropped into the chat the article that that Kyle wrote, that Bridget, the PDF of that. That's the second link that we added.
Excellent.
Well,
Well,
thanks for asking me to participate this evening.
Yeah,
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Night.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.